Alrighty. Hey there, folks. My name is Renessa Boley Layne, and welcome to another conversation on creating your perfect work. I gotta say, I don't get all kind of excited and jittery and all that kind of stuff about folks very often, but I am beyond honored to share the platform with an incredible man whose work that I have followed for years. And I'm excited that he's sharing his time and he's giving us his wisdom and all of that. But I want to welcome Hendricks to the conversation today. I'm going to tell you why I love his work and why I'm so excited that he actually had the time and made the time to be able to share some wisdom with you, and then I'll allow him to introduce himself as well. But I actually read one of Gay's books. He is a New York Times bestselling author of a book called The Big Leap: Conquer Your Hidden Fear and Take Life to the Next Level. And I remember reading that book many years ago and really having to work through what limits I was putting on my success, what limits I was putting on relationships, what limits I was putting on what I wanted in my life. And that book is still, somewhere in my bookshelf today. And then I came across another book that he'd written. And I think he wrote this book. You wrote Five Wishes before The Big Leap, right? Or did it come after?
Yes, I think it was the year before.
So I came across another book as we were preparing to do an interview series around creating your perfect work, and it was called The Five Wishes. And it was how, and the subtitle is how answering one simple question can make your dreams come true. And I thought, he's got to be on our interview series. And fortunately, he had the time and he made the time to share with us. But I'm so delighted for him to be here, in part because as women, when we are trying to create our perfect work, whether that is changing careers radically or stepping into entrepreneurship or launching, this big idea or this message or this mission, oftentimes we can get so caught up in the success of the thing or the next promotion or the next, revenue goal or what have you, that we can lose sight on, man, am I really designing the kind of success that I want, that it's meaningful, that when I look back on my life, that it's a life well lived. And this Five Wishes book and this question, it just sets the foundation for how we make decisions so that our success is meaningful. And so I invited Gay to come and speak to us, and I think this is going to blow our mind, and the dialogue is going to be a lot of fun. But I want to welcome you first and foremost. Thank you for taking the time and sharing with us. We're so delighted to have you here.
Well, thank you so much, Renessa. It's always my pleasure. In fact, these two books that you happen to like are probably my two favorite books that I've ever written.
I've got good taste.
Yeah, you've got excellent taste on that. And I also wanted to call everybody's attention to a good friend of mine, Neil Donald Walsh, wrote the foreword to The Big Leap. He's the author of the Conversations with God series, and I had the pleasure of being the executive producer on his Conversations with God movie. And I encourage you, when you read the book, be sure to read Neil's foreword, because it's a wonderful little piece of writing in itself.
It is. It's actually really, really great. So I'm going to invite Gay to tell us a little bit about himself, kind of what he's doing in the world of work now, and then we'll move into his background. But I want you to give some context around just kind of the mission that you have and the work that you're doing now.
Well, it's a great question, and I have been married to Katie Hendricks. We just finished celebrating our 38th wedding anniversary.
Yay.
And so that's been a big part of my life for the past almost 40 years now. And she and I have written 10 books together, including our book Conscious Loving, that we were first on Oprah with back in 1991, I think. And that's how we first came to the public's attention. I always say I went overnight from working with 6 couples in our living room to working with 10 million people on Oprah, because we literally got the call one night, and they said, "Can you be in Chicago day after tomorrow?" And we had to drop everything and run, but it was really great. I used to be a university professor. That's kind of what I wanted to do all my life. When I was growing up, I would always picture myself being a teacher in a college classroom somewhere. And at the time, I thought I wanted to be an English professor because I loved writing and creative writing and novels and poetry and that kind of thing. As it turned out, I ended up mostly writing books about psychology and spirituality and relationships. Although in the past few years, I've started writing mystery novels, and I've written several mystery novels. So that's another part of my life that we can talk about sometime. But I've loved to write ever since I was a kid. My mother was a writer. She was a
Mhm.
newspaper columnist for the local newspaper,
Mhm.
and she had to turn in a column at 7 o'clock at night to get in the newspaper
Mhm.
the next morning, when the newspaper went out. And I can remember her many times pounding away on her Underwood typewriter with a Camel cigarette hanging out of one mouth, and drinking coffee and pounding on it. It was kind of the soundtrack of my
Mhm.
childhood. Uh, so I grew up in the South and Central Florida, and
Mhm.
I grew up in a kind of a political family. My mother, in addition to her other things, she was the mayor of the town that I
Mhm.
lived in, of 10,000 people, which I still live in a little town of about 10,000 people here in California now. So I had a nice growing up in the South, and then I moved up to New Hampshire to get my master's degree in counseling, and
Mhm.
then on out to Stanford to get my doctoral degree in counseling
Yay!
psychology.
I'm a
So I've been
Stanford
all over
alum,
the
so I
place.
love that. I love that. I received that very well.
And I now live down in Southern California in a mountain valley called the Ojai Valley.
Mhm.
And Katie and I have lived here for almost 20 years now. So here's pretty much what I do in my life is a lot of what I'm doing with you here.
Yeah.
I do a lot of speeches and talks, and I do a lot of conversations about the Big Leap, particularly
Mhm.
because of all my books, Conscious Loving and the Big Leap are the two ones that have actually keep selling more and more every year,
Mhm.
which is what you like to see as a
Yeah.
writer. The chart goes up rather than going down.
Yep.
And so I'm very grateful to all the millions of coaches and therapists and healers who use the Big Leap and Conscious Loving and Five Wishes as kind of tools for their
Yeah.
craft.
Yeah.
Uh,
Absolutely.
we do seminars. We teach seminars here and around the world.
Mhm.
My wife does a lot of the teaching,
Mhm.
and I come in usually for an hour or two and do
Mhm.
stuff with them. And but she's kind of the main teacher. She's a marathon runner. I'm kind of a sprinter, and so
There
I
you
don't
go.
like to stay out there very long at a time. Uh, so that's our life, and so far so good.
Awesome. Well, let me ask you the first question. It's a little more general, but it applies to this audience. Because we're talking about creating your perfect work. And perfect work can look, take a lot of different forms for folks. But oftentimes there's this questioning as to whether or not, this work is right for me, or if I'm going to make a shift, am I sure that this is the thing, or that this is the right direction, or this, how do you know that the work that you're doing right now is the work you're meant to do right now? Like, how does that feel? How do you evaluate that? How do you know when it's time to shift?
Well, one way is that as I'm talking to you right now, I feel just as excited about communicating the ideas as I did 30 years ago on
Wow.
Oprah or 45 years ago in front of a class. To me, there are certain things that I've been privileged to learn about life. And I feel like if I didn't communicate them to the best of my ability every day of my life, I wouldn't be fulfilling my
Yeah.
life purpose.
Hmm.
When I was about 34 years old, I sat down one day and I figured out what the purpose of my life was.
Hmm.
And I was listening to the radio driving down from Denver one time, and
Hmm.
I heard somebody talking about your life purpose on the
Yeah.
radio, and I turned it up and I just heard the tail end of it. But what he was saying, I don't know who this person was, but he was saying that most human misery comes from the lack of a clear purpose, knowing what
Wow.
you really want to do. And notice, instead of just going through the motions of where you've been programmed to be,
Yeah.
he said, you really have to step out of it and say, what do I want to be? So I
Exactly.
thought about that all the way home, and I sat down when I got back, and I sat down on the floor. I like to just sit down kind of on a cushion on the floor when I'm thinking. And
Hmm.
so I sat there for probably about an hour trying to think, what really is the purpose of my life? What above all am I here to accomplish?
Yeah.
And I came up with this idea that's partly in the Big Leap, which is that I'm here to expand every day myself in
Hmm.
love and creativity and abundance
Hmm.
as I inspire people who want to do the same thing, how to
Hmm.
do that.
Hmm.
And so for me, my life comes to fulfillment, not just when I'm having a good time, but when
Yep.
I'm helping other people have a good time too.
Yeah.
Because I've been so blessed, I haven't had to work really in 20, 25 years since thanks to Oprah, blessings to her, wherever she is over the hill today. She lives over the hill about 25
Yes,
miles from
everybody
us.
wants to be blessed by Oprah.
Yeah. And so fortunately, we were able after there to focus pretty much on what we most love to do. I'd say that's the biggest thing too, is to make sure that what you're doing is what you love to be doing. And even if you're in a job where 98% of the time you're not doing what you love to be doing, find 2% of that where you can, and then grow that to 10%. I always ask people when they come here for seminars or they come here to do executive coaching with us, I ask them to go in a little room the first day and spend 10 minutes simply asking this question. What do I most love to do? What do I most love to do? And you'd be surprised at what people can come up with just focusing in 10 minutes, because you see, what we love to do is what I call in the big leap, your genius.
Yeah.
And those two things need to be right side by side and in harmony all the time.
Yeah.
Because if you're doing what you love to do, you'll never work a day in your life. And I can tell you, because I started focusing when I was in my mid 40s on making all my decisions based on, do I really love to do this or not? And I started creating life. At first, I realized I was only doing what I loved to do about 10% of my time.
Interesting.
And the rest of the time, I was doing what other people wanted me to do, or my job and that kind of thing. And so I started thinking, okay, how can I do more of what I most love to do? And I started graduating up from there. And finally, I started saying, okay, now I'm spending 30% of my time doing what I most love to do. Let me see if I can get it up to 50%. And I started over the 10, 15 years, gradually moved it on up and up until, gosh, 20 years ago, I realized I'm doing what I most love to do 90% of the time. And the rest of the time, I'm driving from place to place or eating breakfast or something like that. But now it's, I've based my life on that for so many years. I actually feel bad in my body if I'm not doing what I love to do. If I get stuck in traffic or something like that, I can feel, oh, I wish I had this time to be doing what I love to do. So I think that that's the main gauge to go by, Renessa, is to ask yourself every day, am I feeling that experience of love with what I'm doing right now? And do I feel that sense of excitement in my body that I can't wait to do what I'm getting up every day to do?
And I love the expression, because I look at timelines, and there's a lot of us on this call who think, they've invested 10, 15, 20 years in a certain direction in their career or their business, and there's this feeling of, well, it's too late for me to pivot, or it's too late for me to change, but you were like, I was in my mid 40s when I started really assessing, am I doing what I love? And so A, it's never too late, and B, there's a whole time continuum there. And that if that's a nagging question, that now is the time to start figuring that out, and now is the time to start taking those steps. And man, look at where you could be on a conversation with me. You're sitting here talking about, I haven't worked a day in my life in 20 years, and so I think there's a lot to be said about that as we get on, for folks that are listening. But this is a perfect segue into the 5 wishes. And the reason why that was it's such a precious book to me is the tagline. It's how answering one simple question can make your dreams come true. And I really want folks to be able to start to get a foundation for how to ask questions that give them the answers that are going to give them a life that is far more fulfilling. And so help me understand. Actually, tell us the question. Tell us the conversation and the experience that even led into the 5 wishes, and then we're going to break down that experience and then help people understand how to apply it to themselves. So share that story with us. I read the story, but I'd love to hear you share the story.
I love to tell it. It's seared on my brain, because I really wouldn't be here talking to you had I not had this conversation. I don't think. And well, even before I wrote the book, how the book came about actually was kind of magical in itself, because I had never actually thought about writing a book about this experience. But I happened to be having dinner one night with my wife and a couple of other people, and Neil Walsh, Conversations with God guy.
Yeah.
And he and I, it was a long dinner. It was a banquet sort of thing. And we were there for about 3 hours, and we started telling each other stories about our lives. And I told him the story that Five Wishes is about. And he said at the end of it, he said, "My gosh, have you written a book about that?" And I said, "No, I never really thought about it." He said, "You've got to do it. Go home and do it right now." And so I actually literally did. I went back, and when I got home, I sketched out the beginning of it. So here's what happened.
Okay.
Not long after my wife and I got together, we met in 1980. Okay, so we're coming up now on 40 years from the time we met each other. And so right after we got together, about 6 months after we got together, she moved to Colorado, where I lived, and I was a university professor there, and she set up her private practice there. She's also a psychologist. And so I hadn't really made a commitment to her yet. You know, I knew I was in love with her and everything, but I'd had some unpleasant relationship experiences, and I didn't know if I really wanted to make another big time commitment. And so we went to a party, and the party was an engagement party for a fellow psychologist of mine, and he was getting married again. And I believe, if I remember correctly, it was his 5th marriage. Yep. It's a little hazy now. I haven't actually read the book.
That's what it said. It was 5.
It was 5. Okay. Yep. So, you know, when your friend is getting married for the 5th time, and you've known him through number 4 and number 3, you know, you begin to think, well, can I really get my heart behind this one? And so we went to the party, and my wife is much more social than I am. She loves to talk to people at parties, and I'm usually kind of a quiet guy, go sit on the sidelines, and I'm not much of a schmoozer, actually. And so during the party, it was a big noisy party, and I wandered back through this big house, and I found the library, which was full of wonderful books, you know, just the kind of books I like, a lot of books on transformation and poetry and that kind of thing, Rumi poetry and that kind of thing. And so I was leafing through the books and kind of having some quiet time away from the party. And this tall, bald-headed gentleman, about 60 years of age, walked into the library, and he took a look at me and he said, "Oh, you're escaping from the party too, huh?" Yeah. And I said, yeah. And so we kind of bonded over this. And so we struck up a conversation, and we agreed that we didn't like small talk. So he said, "How about some big talk?" And so I said, "Okay." And I said, "How about going first?" And he said, "Well, I almost died some months ago." I said, "Oh, I'm sorry." He said, "Don't be sorry, because it was the best thing that ever happened to me." And I said, "Really? Why?" And he said the following thing. He said, "I'll tell you. Instead of telling you, I'll just do it with you right now. And pretend you're on your deathbed and you don't know whether you're going to live or die, but you think you're going to die. And I come by and I ask you, and I say, was your life a complete success?"
Wow.
"And would you say yes or no?" And I said, "Well, honestly, I'd have to say no, because there's a whole bunch of things I haven't even accomplished that I really want." And so that's how the conversation came about. So I want you and your viewers to do this very same thing that he showed me how to do. So what you do is you picture yourself being on your deathbed at the end of a life. And if I come by and I say, "Was your life a complete success?" And you say, "Yes, it absolutely was." And I say, "Well, what were the 5 things that made your life a complete success?" So that's where 5 Wishes actually came from.
Wow.
And so what I did was I went home and I figured out what those 5 things were. So I actually went and did the work. I was so inspired by this conversation that I went home and I actually came up with 5 things.
Yeah.
And I'd love to just enumerate what those 5.
Yes, please.
Okay, great. The number one thing that I came up with that I really wanted that would make my life a complete success is that I want I wanted a relationship with a woman with whom I could grow and change over the years, but the relationship just kept growing the whole time. And I realized that that's what I wanted more than anything in the world, because I'd had some material success. I'd already written a little book that was for educators that was quite popular. And I was a successful university professor. But the one thing I hadn't been able to master is how to have a long-term relationship that lasted longer than a few years. And most of my relationships, I always say they had the trajectory of the Titanic, because they would start with great fanfare, yay, and then it would hit the iceberg, and it took me until I was about 35 years old before I figured out I kept hitting the exact same iceberg over and over again, and the iceberg wasn't out there, it was in here. And so once I figured that out, whoosh, things really changed. And so that was my number one wish, though, that I wanted, because I figured, what's the use of a PhD in psychology from Stanford if I can't get along with one person? And so that became number one. Number two, I figured, what would really make my life a complete success? Well, it would be to live in a state of completion with people, my friends, my family, particularly my family of origin, because I grew up in kind of a wild and crazy family in the South that, half of them were Southern aristocrats and half of them were horse thieves and riverboat gamblers and that kind of thing. So it was just a lot of past to get out of. And so that became a big thing to me, to live in a state of completion. And what I meant by that was there's nothing I hadn't listened to from other people and nothing I hadn't said that was important. Okay. So that was number two. And my number three was I came up with that I wanted to learn how to write from my heart instead of my head. I wanted to really learn how to express what was really true for me through my books. See, I'd been to University of New Hampshire and Stanford, and I was heavily educated in the research area of things, but what I hadn't learned to trust was my own heart and my own experience. I always tell my students that the longest journey they ever make is the 12-inch journey from here to here. And I made that journey, thankfully, but it took that, I developed that third goal to learn how to write from my heart. And so that led to my book, Learning to Love Yourself, which was the first book I wrote after I met my wife, and still is a good selling book to this day here, almost 40 years later. So I learned to write from my heart. Now, number four is a little more mystical and tricky to define, because I said that I wanted to have an experiential understanding of the creator force in life, whether you call it God or spirit or Allah or whatever it is. It's the creator force, and you can kind of feel it and you see it and you are it, but what is it really? And so I'd grown up in the Southern Methodist Church, very, it didn't allow much room for mysticism. It was all pretty well laid out. Boom, 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 boom. And so I discovered this whole area of meditation and mysticism and things like that became incredibly important, which is really opening up to your own individual connection with the universe. Directly, not filtered through anything else. And so that became incredibly important to me. The fifth thing, which I'm still engaged with today, is what I call savoring. Savoring. Just enjoying, just being here for every moment of life. I told a story in the book about going out with my daughter when she was in the 5th or 6th grade, and the 5th grade, I think, and going out Halloween with her, and she had made this incredible costume where she made herself into a trash can with a lid on the top, and the liner was where you're supposed to put the candy. And it was just the most ingenious little outfit. And as I was taking her around, when I got through with it and we went back at the house, I realized, wow, that whole time I was also thinking about this article that I was working on. So I was like only halfway there. And I'd missed out on some magic moments of her life. And even though I was there, I wasn't there. And so that was a big wake-up call for me. So that became my number 5 goal for my life, was to savor the moments, the precious moments, to be there for them. So all 5 of those have either come true or in the process of coming true. And I think the place to start, though, is just by having that heart-to-heart talk with yourself and say, what are the 5 things that I really want that would make my life a complete success?
Wow. No, I love, one, I love the 5, and I can certainly relate to some of them. Clearly you are savoring every moment. It's obvious, it radiates from the screen, which is awesome. But I remember when I read about your number 3 and writing about what was sacred and what was important to you. And I think that as women, as we are looking to, grow our careers or do our businesses and the like, there is a difference between what happens in the head and what we think we have to do to be successful, and really understanding, well, what's in my heart, and what do I really want to contribute to the world. And for me, if I had to think about what one of those 5 wishes would be, it would certainly be, as I think about my own business, and I love what I do. I have an incredible impact on people. I see their lives change and grow and thrive, and I'm brilliant at what I do. And there is a deeper level of realness and spirituality and authenticity, and personality that I look to bring into that space. There's a lot more writing and communicating and thought generation and idea. And so even this conversation, this interview series, is born out of that desire to do much more dialoguing and exchanging of wonderful ideas and connecting with people and all of that kind of stuff. And so being aware of what success really looks like and means for you outside of the construct of what it should mean or what it means for other people, I can see how important that is in directing decisions, right? Because then you're able to get a much better sense of, is this right answer for me? Because sometimes an option's not good or bad. It's just a matter of whether it's right for you, right?
Yes, and I think it's what you're touching on too is so important, because we need to learn how to come from the inside out in our lives, not to go from the outside in. In other words, a lot of times, advertising and stuff like that would make us think that if you have certain things, the right kind of car, the right kind of clothes, you will feel a certain way. Well, I think if everybody hasn't figured it out that that's a total lie by now, wake up,
Let me
because
go
it's
get my
not
Nikes.
especially around the holidays.
Yeah.
And so we need to learn to come from the inside out, meaning, what is the real purpose of my life here? What is my chosen purpose? I say chosen purpose because I don't think it's ever a good idea to go along with somebody else's idea about what the purpose of your life ought to be. That life only becomes really rich and meaningful when you say, what do I really want?
Yeah.
How can I serve in my particular way? Because everybody, I think where we a lot of times get ourselves in trouble is by comparing ourselves to other people.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's that wonderful Jewish proverb about that when you come to the end of your life, they're not going to ask you, why were you not Moses, but why were you not Gay Hendricks?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's so important, because if we get into comparison, we're always going to lose, because you wouldn't have compared yourself to the other person anyway, unless you had some anxiety about it some way.
Exactly. Let me ask you this question, because, oftentimes the questions are simple, but very, very difficult to answer, right? And I remember in reading the book, The 5 Wishes, you actually, you talk about and you comment on the emotions that you felt at the time that, I think his name was Ed, was actually asking you the question, and you talked about the anxiety, and then you talked about the relief, and you talked about just the different, emotions that you went through as you were being posed with the question. So for the audience and folks that are listening, because again, it's a simple enough question, but it could be really, really difficult to answer. What do you believe are some of the challenges or the obstacles that make this a hard question for people to answer for themselves?
I think the first challenge is simply to trust yourself enough to ask yourself the
Mm.
big questions of life, rather than relying on what somebody else says about it, to sit down for 10 minutes and say, yeah, what do I really want? What would
Mhm.
make me feel fulfilled? And
Mhm.
then maybe if you have people around you, a
Yeah.
family, ask them too. What are your 5 big wishes for your life?
Mhm.
I've had these conversations with my daughter, with other
Mhm.
members of my family, in addition to thousands and thousands of clients and people at our seminars. And I think that a second barrier is that, beyond not trusting ourselves enough to ask the question,
Yeah.
is um, number 2 is the presence of fear
Mhm.
in many of our lives.
Mhm.
I talk about in The Big Leap about some of the common fears that people have. One of them being the fear that there's something fundamentally wrong with you, or
Mhm.
fundamentally undeserving of love
Mhm.
and abundance and good
Mhm.
times. A lot of us carry that around from early programming.
Mhm.
A lot of us also get caught up in the fear of what I call the fear of outshining, which we get
Mm.
afraid that if we really let ourselves shine to the fullness of our light, it will somehow detract from other people. It'll take
Interesting.
love from them that they deserve more. Well, I've never been able to see it that way, because what happens, and I've watched this thousands of times, when one person begins to flower and shine, it doesn't make other people feel bad.
Yeah.
It inspires them. And so we need to get over the mindset that our flowering is going to cause any harm anywhere,
Mhm.
because if we're doing the right kind of flowering and flourishing and shining from inside ourselves, it can only do good for ourselves and other
Mhm.
people.
No, I think that's great. You also mentioned in the book that there were common limiting beliefs that people had when it comes to their ability to attain, like even if they're able to get clear on, these are my 5 wishes, this is what success would look like for me on my deathbed, or this, what have you. There's different limiting beliefs that people experience in thinking that that's even possible for them. What have you noticed over the years and in your conversations with people that become common belief systems that will make you question whether or not it's even possible for you?
The biggest one is the belief that I don't deserve love, or I
Mm-hmm.
don't deserve abundance, or I don't deserve to have a life that's good and useful.
Mm-hmm.
So it's the whole deserving issue.
Mm-hmm.
And let's dispense with that one right away, because
Yeah.
nobody deserves or doesn't deserve
Yeah.
anything. It's all about what you choose to make it.
Mm-hmm.
And so forget the deserving part of the conversation, because it's not even relevant. What's relevant is the 10 seconds of wonder it takes.
Mm-hmm.
It takes only just a few seconds of pure wonder to go down in there and say,
Wow. Mm-hmm.
what are my limiting beliefs?
Mm-hmm.
Another big limiting belief is that um, if I have more, it will lead to more burden,
Mm.
because I'm
Oh,
feeling
okay.
burdened now. And if I do more or get more successful, I'll just feel more burden.
Mm-hmm.
But that's also a very limiting way of looking at it, because what you need to do is learn to work smart, not to
Mm-hmm.
work harder and harder and harder, work
Mm-hmm.
smarter and smarter and smarter. It's like, I compare it to, in a boat, you don't want to be up in the bow trying to steer the boat. You want to be back in the boat so you can really see where you're going.
Mm-hmm.
And to do that, you need to get clear of those old limiting beliefs that are in your way.
Mm-hmm.
And so another one is that if I expand to a new belief system,
Mm-hmm.
it's being disloyal to people that were
Mm.
around for my old belief system.
Yeah.
You feel guilty about leaving behind family or leaving behind friends. But again, that's not necessary. It's just a thing we get caught up with in our
Yeah.
beliefs, because it's just as easy to get free and to have other people experience freedom from
Mm-hmm.
the changing of your beliefs.
Yeah. Yeah. There's something that you wrote in the book that I thought was really interesting, and I didn't write it down, so I'm gonna have to paraphrase it. But it came back to this question, because oftentimes folks will talk about how, I don't really know what I want to do in my life. I'm confused, or I'm not sure. I've been trying to figure it out for years, and the reality is I have yet to meet one person who really didn't know what they wanted. Now, they may not have been asking the right questions, or they may not have been equipped with the right questions. But when you get below the fears and the beliefs and the shoulds and all that, you'll get to the heart and the core and the truth of what it is. And it is just as plain as day, right? So I never quite buy into the confusion at the core. But what I find interesting with this question, and in your book you said, I think Ed may have said it, that the bigger the question, the faster you need to answer it, or something like that. It had something to do with not running away from the question and thinking, oh, well, I got to think about that, or, let me ponder it, or, I need some time. And he pressed you on. He was like, no. This moment is all you need in order to really get honest. And so do you find that with this question, as you're asking folks, that the honesty, if they're willing to lean into that honesty, that the answer surfaces along with its fear and its, all that other kind of stuff, but that the answers bubble up pretty clearly when you're willing to lean into the space?
It's really true. The big move is just to open yourself up to it and trust yourself enough to even ask yourself. Mm-hmm. Because a lot of people will do this strange bit of body language. As I begin, I'll start to say something like this big question we started talking about, like, if you're on your deathbed and I came by and I asked you, was your life a complete success? Even before I ask the question, they'll often begin, like just even the thought of asking a question gets them confused.
Yeah.
Because they've been so used to not trusting themselves for so long and having information fed in from one direction rather than coming from your heart down here from the inside out.
Mm-hmm. No, I think it's the whole idea of being able to trust ourselves is one message that I think keeps landing and keeps resonating. And so as women are looking to discover and design and get highly paid to do work they love, the encouragement there is to be able to trust what surfaces, what you hear from yourself, what you see, what you feel. Sometimes we're like, oh, I don't trust my feelings. I can suppress that and just put my nose to the grind. But all of those senses, both the tangible and the physical and the spiritual, all of that communicates, and there's a message there that's true for you. Now that message may not be true for me, and that's okay, but learning how to trust that for you is critically important to ensuring that you're right direction. As they say, your ladder's leaning against the right wall and all of that. But to kind of future pace a little bit, so you get your 5, wishes. Now what do? Now I've got this kind of blueprint of what success looks like or what perfection looks like for me. I may be far from that. I may be close to that. But how do you then begin to take the steps in your life to make that ideal a reality? Because clearly you and Katie have done something right in the near 40 years since you made that decision and that commitment to her. But what did you do in the process to make that true?
It's all about commitment and recommitment. In other words, when Katie and I got together, for example, we made some specific commitments to each other. Like we committed to be 100% honest with each other, right? Mm-hmm. That was a big one. Mm-hmm. And we also committed to listening generously to the other person instead of listening to find fault or listening to criticize or listening to whatever, just to listen to what the other person said. Mm-hmm. So we made these big commitments to each other on our wedding day. But it was recommitment that saved the day, because later on, we would find ourselves in situations where we were not speaking honestly to each other, or we were not listening generously to each other. And then we'd have to stop in our tracks and say, okay, is this still what we want? And then we would recommit to being honest with each other, to listening generously. And we had 2 or 3 other things too we committed to each other. Another big one was we committed to each other, instead of blame, to always take responsibility for things. Because blame is one of the major things that breaks up relationship. Yeah. And so we decided to eliminate it from our relationship. We decided 40 years ago to eliminate blame and criticism from our
Mm-hmm.
relationship. And
Mm-hmm.
it took us a number of years to do that. But for the last 20 or 25 years, neither one of us have said a blameful or critical thing
Wow.
to the other person.
Wow.
And that's quite a delicious way to live, I'll tell you, because
Yeah.
in the absence of blame and criticism, creativity can really flourish.
Mm-hmm.
When people are always nyeh, 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 nyeh at each other, they're eating up the creative energy in the relationship that could be used for their own transformation and for the well-being of the relationship. And so we made these commitments to each other, but it was actually, like falling off the horse and then getting back on and recommitting, falling off the horse again, then getting back on and recommitting.
Yeah.
And that took many, many years, but the
40
payoff
years
is
later,
huge.
that's right. So then how do we translate that into kind of this whole concept of perfect work, right? Because obviously you had to make a commitment when you decided that one of your wishes was that you wanted to write things that were much more, sacred to your, to your heart and more meaningful and that kind of thing as well. And you'd already had a very successful career in academia. You've been published. There were lots of things that were, and opportunities that I'm sure were still coming your way in that space. How does that analogy of commitment and recommitment apply to women who may be listening and are just ready to be honest and say, here's who I want to be in the world. Here's the message I want to get out. Here's how I want to contribute in the marketplace. How do they begin to make the commitment? And then what does recommitment look like for them?
I think a lot of times it begins with a 10-minute conversation where
Mm-hmm.
you sit down and talk to people you work with or your
Mm-hmm.
boss or whoever, and you talk honestly about where you want to go and what you want to be doing and that
Mm-hmm.
kind of thing, to begin to open up to find out if there's a possibility of doing more and more of that kind of thing in the current situation.
Mm-hmm.
I always say make the best of where you are as a bridge until you can really jump off on your own.
Mm-hmm.
I was a university professor for 21 years, and so that was a great place to be until suddenly one day I wanted to go on and do something different. So I moved on from that. But I think it's a good idea to really tend your own garden where you are, rather than thinking you have to go off and live in a cave in Tibet or, do something more radical.
Mm-hmm. You said that there was one piece of wisdom that you used to make every day of your life better for the last 2 decades or so. What was that one piece of wisdom?
Well, let me. I'm almost looking across the room here to see if I can see our little wristband that we give out. Oh yes, if you will hold on for 1 second, let me get this.
Sure.
We give out this little wristband at the end of our trainings, and you can't see it, but on the side it says breathe, move, love.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason we have it on there is because it's like, if you can't think of anything else to do, just take a couple of good, big, liberating breaths.
Mm-hmm.
And move your body a little bit. Breathe and move. Just get some juice flowing through your body. The third thing is love. Breathe, move, love. Because love is the only thing that can encompass its opposite. You can love yourself for not loving yourself, for example. Even if you don't love yourself, you can love yourself for that. Yeah. And so love is the biggest thing that we've discovered yet, because it can embrace its opposite. And so there are very few things ultimately in life that don't come down to, well, let me give you an example. I had a client once who had a big physical problem. She had a form of cancer in her female reproductive organs. And she wanted to heal it herself. And she'd been to the doctors and everything like that. But as a last resort, I was working with her a little bit. And so what she did was invite the question of, what's this really all about? What's this really all about? And so it took her 2 weeks of asking that big question. And finally, one day she was sitting on her back porch, just kind of reflecting, what is this all about in my life? When she had this huge breakthrough memory of an entire sequence of sexual abuse at a very early age. And she said if you'd asked her about this 10 minutes before, she would have said, no, nothing like that ever happened. And then all of a sudden it was, boom, it was there as a result of asking these questions about a physical illness. Well, I'm not saying this is going to happen every time, but as she got herself cleared from that early trauma, her physical illness also disappeared. And so that's an extreme example of what can happen as a result of really turning inward and asking ourselves what's really going on. There's I think in either Five Wishes or The Big Leap, I quoted from the Gospel of Thomas, which was one of the apocryphal books of the Bible that didn't make it into the official Bible, but there's a great quotation in there that I think has a lot to do with the way I look at healing. It says, if you bring forth what is within you will heal you. If you do not bring forth what is within you will destroy you. I've seen that so many times that I think all of us have this genius we want to bring through, this something we want to do with our lives, whether it's making a great soup or writing a great symphony, or it doesn't really matter what thing it is. It's just something that you can lose yourself in, something that you can commit yourself to, something that is so big for you that you could do it all day long, even if you weren't getting paid for it. That's what you're looking for.
That's awesome. So as we begin to close out, there's been so many like nuggets of wisdom, and it all boils down to having the courage and being willing to answer the question and trust the answer that shows up and go there. And so as women begin to think about what work looks like and how it can be different and all of that, before we start chasing the pathway and the vehicles and the ideas, the encouragement is to really get honest about what do we truly desire? What does that look like? Whether we know how to get there or not, whether we're afraid of it or not, be willing to embrace what does show up and play with that. And my encouragement is to, if you haven't gotten the book Five Wishes and or The Big Leap, they're both amazing. And so I highly recommend them, and you can get them on Amazon and anywhere else. And Gay also has a free gift that he wants to offer to the group as well, thought leadership or whatnot, that I think will also bless you and encourage you and allow you to continue to follow some of the work that he does. So I'll kind of leave it to you as to what you would like to share. And then we'll make sure that folks are able to either get a link to it or have access to it in some way after the conversation. So I'll leave that to you.
All right, great. We have a couple of wonderful things that I think you'll enjoy a lot, you and your folks. And I also want to appreciate you for doing this for women also, because it's my view that it's really women's consciousness that's changing the world. And I'm very, very grateful for the amazing women in my life, certainly, and all around the world who are doing such amazing work at expanding their consciousness. And please forgive us men for the last 5,000 years of messing things up, and we'll do a better job in the future with your leadership.
Well, we have some grace on you, that's all. So awesome. Well, I appreciate you being here. I appreciate you sharing. Thank you for taking the time. And for everyone that's on the call, I'll speak for Gay as well. We want to wish you the absolute best to your success and happiness, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.